Hello and a very warm welcome to the Oxfordian Frontline. Thank you for joining me here. This is a picture of Henry de Vere, 18th Earl of Oxford. If you look him up in the books of nobility, you will learn that he is the son of Edward de Vere, the so-called poetical Earl of Oxford, by his second wife Elizabeth née Trentham. Not what contemporary gossips were saying. They were impugning him as the natural son of Henry Rosalie, 3rd Earl of Southampton, by his mistress, Lady Penelope Rich. If you read contemporary works such as Willoughby his Avisa of 1594, or indeed the Shakespeare sonnets, you learn that the poet Shakespeare is sharing a mistress with the fair youth Henry Rosalie, and this of course is what is being alluded to by the cheekiest of all cheeky contemporary writers, Thomas Nash, when he dedicates a book to the Earl of Southampton at the height of this scandal, writing, "A dear lover you are, as of the lovers of poets, as of poets themselves," a highly libelous remark that had to be immediately withdrawn from that book. It does seem a lot of contemporary writers, whether they're writing about Shakespeare or about the Earls of Oxford, were quite unable to leave this scandal alone, and they tried many little tricks to get their knowledge of the scandal in without being caught and had up for libel. This book, 1599, so that's 4 years before the death of the poetical Earl of Oxford. This writer wishes very much to be anonymous. "Vouchsafe my name to be nameless," and over the page he writes, "And God grant to that Earl of Oxford, mirror of highness, happiness in this world. God bless his lady, the Countess Elizabeth Trentham, that right true maiden of honour, immaculate virgin." Well, since when do you call a woman who has been married for nearly a decade and has a 6 or 7-year-old son a maiden, let alone an immaculate virgin? Immaculate virgin, of course, is alluding to the Catholic doctrine of immaculate conception relating to the mother of Mary. An immaculate virgin, therefore, is a mother who has a child but has not had sexual intercourse in order to get that child and is not thereby tainted with original sin. Again, I would say this is a very libelous remark. Many of you, I know, will have already watched the titles I put there on the right, in each of which we have a contemporary witness to this appalling scandal. If you haven't seen them all or some of them, please catch up with them. Corroboration, of course, very important. They are all literary references, and today I want to look at 2 pictorial allusions to the great scandal, one of those being the engraving that you see there on your left. We might start by asking the question, why is this in fact a double portrait of him with the Earl of Southampton? Does the artist realize, does he know that the Earl of Southampton is his natural father? Is that why we have behind the Earl of Oxford's head, "Vero nihil verius," nothing truer than truth, the Vere family motto, and that rather shifty look perhaps in Southampton's eyes? And what is this entanglement of fingers? Some sort of indication of a secret pact, a tryst, a treaty, an alliance? Well, that's what we're going to look into. Let's have a look at the picture in its broadest terms. The first thing perhaps to notice about it is its title, "A Portraiture of the Right Honourable Lords, the 2 most noble Henrys revived, the Earls of Oxford and Southampton." I think that tells us 2 interesting things about this. One, that the most important thing that they have in common is the name Henry. Notice the great capitalization of Henrys, more important than there being earls and there being colonels in different regiments in the same campaign, etc. And the second interesting thing is they are 2 most notable Henrys revived, which suggests that by the time this picture was made, they were both dead. In other words, it was made after July 1625, when the Earl of Oxford died, the Earl of Southampton having died a few months earlier. Now, I'd like you to look very carefully, if you will, at the little scene that's going on underneath the horses' bellies. You'll see there a town with what looks like a siege, certain military action of soldiers camped around it. The town is labelled Der Wehr. Now, this is very curious because there was no siege of De Vere, there was no battle of De Vere, there is no evidence that Henry, Earl of Oxford, and Henry, Earl of Southampton, had anything to do with De Vere during their campaign in the Netherlands. Why then is De Vere written here? Particularly I ask that question because that town, if you look carefully at it, is not the Dutch town of De Vere anyway. It is actually a town about 1,200 kilometers away called Pressburg. We now know it as Bratislava. How do I know it is Pressburg? Well, because this picture was in fact copied from another picture. And here it is. And if you look under the horses on the first picture, you can see that it is marked Pressburg. You have exactly the same buildings as in the second picture, and the river is marked Danubius Flu, i.e. it is the Danube. And if you look across to the picture of Southampton and Oxford, you see that the copyist has erased the Danube. So why, one might ask, does he not simply erase Pressburg from the picture? Why does he not just leave a space there? Why does he bother to write De Vere when, as I said, there was no incident at Vere, no battle at De Vere in any way? The picture is of Pressburg. The reason has to be that he's interested in the name De Vere, the name of the Dutch town from which it is said that the family of De Vere took their name. If you read Percival Golding, who was Edward de Vere's first cousin, who was given exclusive access to the archives of the De Vere family, he writes, "From this small town," that's De Vere in Holland, "the great and generous name of Vere first took this original, as in that age noble families did likewise take a surname from the places of their dwelling or principal origins, which continued to their posterity." That's about 1619, so a bit before the engraving was made, and certainly it was a known fact, or at least it was a fact that was bandying around, that the Vere family had taken their name from this Dutch town. If you read the diaries of John Evelyn from July 1641, "We went this evening from Flushing to De Vere, whence the most ancient and illustrious Earls of Oxford derive their family, who have spent so much blood in assisting the state during their wars." So quite clearly De Vere is written there on account of the name, and it is the name that is of interest. This, of course, brings up the question, why did the engraver of Oxford and Southampton choose to copy this picture on your left? What message is being sent out by copying this particular picture? And as you know, I don't like the idea of just laziness or mistake or whatever. I never accept that. The people in this age, the artists, were incredibly cunning, incredibly devious, and everything is thought out very, very carefully. It wasn't just, oh, there's a nice picture of two men on horses, I tell you what, I'll just stick the heads of Southampton and Oxford upon it and that'll do. No, absolutely not. There will be a reason, and that's what I want to look into. And to understand why this particular picture has been copied, we need to look carefully at the original and find out what it is about. The young man on the left is Frederick, Count of Palatine. He was a German married to Princess Elizabeth, the daughter of James I, and it was on his account, since he was a Protestant, that the English sent troops over to help him against the Catholic forces of the Holy Roman Empire and the Catholic forces of Spain. That's what these English soldiers like Oxford and Southampton were doing in the Netherlands and elsewhere. Next to him, the older man, is Gabriel Bethlen, a Transylvanian prince, described here as King of Hungary, who in October 1619 laid siege to Pressburg and took control of it. And by doing so, he was able, at Pressburg, to sign a treaty with the Count of Palatine, described as an eternal alliance of perpetual and inviolable peace, aeternam foedus perpetuaque ac inviolabilis pax. Well, actually, it was no such thing. The whole thing collapsed very, very quickly. Indeed, I think this picture was actually drawn after the collapse. You see up in the top there, pro lege et grege. That's a very famous saying indeed, which should be pro rege lege et grege, meaning for king, law and people. But king seems to have been lopped off of it. The reason for that, I'm sure, is that the so-called King of Bohemia, Count of Palatine, was kicked out in less than a year. He is known as the Winter King. So by November 1620, he was out, and by December 1621, Gabriel Bethlen, who never really became King of Hungary but was elected King of Hungary, he renounced all his right to being King of Hungary, as they were all roundly routed and defeated by the Habsburgs. So I think that this is after December 1621, when neither of them was actually king. There's a little joke, I suspect, going on here. The sharp-eyed among you will have noticed that he is described as Gabriel Bator rather than Gabriel Bethlen, as who he is. But Bator was in fact Bethlen's great enemy at one point, who was murdered in 1613, and some people suspect that Bethlen may have had a hand in his murder. So there's some sort of joke going on here, calling him Bator, but he is, I assure you, Gabriel Bethlen. Okay, so with that in mind, let us go back to the two pictures and ask that question once again. Why did the engraver of Southampton and Oxford base his engraving on this picture of the Count of Palatine and Gabriel Bethlen? Well, I'm sure you've kind of got the answer already, because they share a narrative, and it's that narrative that the second engraving is hinting at. In the first, we have this older man who usurped this town, allowing this younger man, who was not Bohemian by blood, to enjoy the ancient title King of Bohemia, sealing a treaty of eternal alliance with him and his heirs. And in the picture over on the right, we have this older man who usurped this name, allowing this younger man, who was not a Vere by blood, to enjoy the ancient title Earl of Oxford, thus sealing an eternal alliance with him and his heirs. So we see now what is actually going on here, and that's why Der Vere has been written down there, to draw attention to the name. There is, of course, something rather poignant about all this, but it was known to the gossips back in England at the time. Southampton, as I say, died in 1624. An elegy was written for him by Thomas Heywood, which reads, "If only that bare honour here were meant which heraldry allows thee from descent, and only that inherent understood which lineally nobilitates the blood, it ranks thee equal with the greats of peers." In other words, what Heywood is saying is, if we only count coat of arms and inherent blood, then you, Southampton, are ranked equal with the greatest of peers. Of course, the greatest of peers is the Earl of Oxford. It is the primary earldom of England, and Heywood clearly knows that Southampton's son is the Earl of Oxford, and thus he is linked to the coat of arms of Oxford and the lineal blood of the Earl of Oxford. The poem goes on, "Of that which is not ours, why should we boast? The noble seeds in our forefathers sown may well be termed our grandsires, not our own. But happy those their ruins can repair, and husband still their names from heir to heir." An obvious dig at the 17th Earl of Oxford, whose house of Vere was more or less in ruins, but happily he managed to husband the name from heir to heir, despite the fact that his son was not his own. Now, as I said, this picture of Southampton and Oxford can be dated to after both of their deaths. And again, that is a reason why they based it on this rather tragic picture, which is after December 1621, when neither of them were actual kings. So this whole idea of these eternal lines, the eternal treaty of Bethlen and the Count of Palatine, the eternal lines of Vere, fathered by the Earl of Southampton, all came to nothing. It brings, I think, an extra piquancy to our reading of Shakespeare's 18th sonnet. You'll remember that the 17 first sonnets are called procreation sonnets, in which the poet urges the fair youth Southampton to have a son, for love of me. And he knows that Southampton is a narcissist, so he uses the argument that if you don't have a son for love of me, your beauty will die when you die, and that will be the end of it, or die when you get old. And one of the arguments that crops up a couple of times is your summer will be cut short by ragged winter. Of course, the 18th sonnet is a sonnet of joy, a sonnet where the young son has been born, the Vere line is safe, supposedly, and the young boy will eventually become the 18th Earl of Oxford, hence the number 18. No longer will the fair youth summer be cut short by ragged winter. He's done the job, he's had a son. Indeed, thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. Eternal lines here obviously referring to the eternal hereditary lines of the line of Vere from Southampton's loins. So long as men can breathe, or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. Notice the comma at the end, not a mistake, comma deliberately put there to emphasize the idea of the eternal lines going on forever, hence the sentence doesn't come to an end. So long as men can breathe, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. Of course, Edward de Vere's servant, Anthony Mundy, knew exactly what this was alluding to. He knew that it was about the 18th Earl of Oxford. And when he wrote to the 18th Earl of Oxford, much later, he wrote, "Old Lord Edward is still living in you and cannot die so long as you breathe." An obvious allusion to the 18th sonnet written to the 18th Earl of Oxford, saying that the great lines, and in this case, of course, he's talking about the literary lines, not the hereditary lines, cannot die so long as you breathe. A lovely piece of irony there. Now, I would like to turn to the second of the two pictures that I want to examine, showing that Henry Vere is the natural son of Southampton. It's not this one, but I just want to remind you of the very distinctive looks of Henry de Vere. I've shown you this picture before. It's probably one of the latest ones where he's looking quite corpulent. And this one, of course, I remind you because the first thing you notice about the one I want to discuss is that it doesn't appear to look like him at all. And why should that be? This is an engraving by Robert Vaughan, an extremely distinguished engraver who knew exactly how to capture someone's likeness if he wanted to. Well, again, I suspect you're ahead of me always because you're guessing the answers to what I'm going to show you, and namely that this picture of Henry Vere, supposedly of Henry Vere, is specially made in order to give lots of little clues and hints as to his natural paternity, that is effectively taken from this picture of the Earl of Southampton, which was done by Simon de Pass in 1617. It actually has been dated. The one of the Earl of Oxford hasn't been dated. It must come at least from the 1620s because he seems to be a military commander and he didn't get any military command until later in his life. But we don't really know. I suspect it might even be posthumous, despite the fact that it says it's to be sold by Compton Holland, and Compton Holland died in 1622. But as we're about to see, it is a very libelous picture, and it may well be that it was done by someone after Compton Holland's death in his name. Compton Holland's company was continued by his widow. Right, if we look, for instance, at the tops of their heads, who would wager all their money, if that's all they had seen, that these two men were not in fact one man, one and the same? You can see that there seems to be a deliberate energy going behind making them look similar. If we look at their ears, they both have an earring on them. The earring was quite a sign of the Earl of Southampton. Other people wore earrings. It wasn't so popular in the 1620s. Southampton wore one often as a young man. What I think is more interesting than the earring actually is what we see on one of the faces. That's Lord Oxford's, and we see what appears to be a sort of soft, almost teenaged down. It's not something you would see on a 30-year-old plus military commander, and it has been done to remind us of what Southampton was like at the time when the young Earl of Oxford was conceived. In fact, from October 1592, we have a published description of him. "No youth there present was more beautiful or more brilliant in the learned arts than this young Prince of Hampshire, though his face was scarcely adorned by a tender down." Something that was even remembered after his death in an elegy which recalls his youth. "Sweet youth, what made thee hide thine amorous face, and cheeks scarce downy in a steely case?" This tribute to Southampton after his death is obviously recalling Venus and Adonis of Shakespeare. We know from contemporaries, such as William Covell, we know that the Earl of Southampton was the model for Adonis in Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis, in which Adonis is described as hard as steel, hid his angry brow, the tender spring upon his tempting lip shows him unripe. I hope that some of you, many of you, have read a wonderful poem called Lover's Complaint, published for the first time with the sonnets and is intimately connected to the sonnet story. And in that we have a woman who is clearly Edward de Vere's daughter, who's been jilted by Southampton, who is crying by a river and telling her story to an old man who was recently a courtier but has rather lost his place at court, who is leading his oxen. So he's the Earl of Oxenford, who she calls father, and she tells her complaint about the young lover and how she was jilted by him. Remember that Southampton was engaged to Oxford's daughter and then jilted her. Anyway, the young man is described as having small show of man was yet upon his chin, his phoenix down began but to appear like unshorn velvet on that termless skin. Another wonderful description of Southampton's clearly very remarkable down on his cheek, which is showing in this engraving of the young Earl of Oxford. Perhaps even more telling, I think, than that is this love lock dribbling down the left-hand side of the Earl of Oxford's shoulder. There's no evidence that the Earl of Oxford ever had a love lock. It would have been way out of fashion in 1620 if he had, and certainly not befitting of a commander in the army to have a love lock like that. It was the absolute brand of Southampton as a youth, and if you look at the pictures of him and look at his left shoulder, you see from the earliest pictures that long lock of hair coming down over his left shoulder time after time after time. It was his, as I say, it was almost his logo, his brand, if you like, so that putting the love lock onto the Earl of Oxford is a very telling way of connecting him to the young, randy Earl of Southampton. We see both of them wearing extremely big ruffs, and just underneath those ruffs, if you look carefully, you see they've got the same identical collar. In fact, also, if you look very carefully, you'll see they're wearing exactly the same gloves. So it's a sort of idea that the son is fitting into his father's clothes. And of course, they both have the Marshal's baton. I'll come to that in a moment. Notice how their Christian names, Henry, on both occasions seem to be disappearing behind the decorative mantling on the side, as though to draw attention to the similarity of the name Henry on both of them, and to say that the younger Henry de Vere, was indeed given the name after Henry Rosalie, his natural father. Notice also the word generosissimi, nothing wrong with that. You might see that on such portraits, but it's a choice of word that is interesting. If you look at the Southampton picture, we have praenobile. Generosissimi means most noble, but of course contains the stem of what we now talk about genes and genetics. They didn't know about genes and genetics then, but they certainly knew about things being innate or inherent, passed through the blood. And rosissimi, Rosa, of course, is a rose, hinting at Rosalie, the surname of the Earl of Southampton. There was a saying, stirps rudis urturca est, stirps generosa rosa. So everybody was aware of this connection. A person of base stock is a stinging nettle, one of noble stock, a rose. If you look at a presentation I've put online called Thomas Porter New, you'll see exactly the same little joke is being made about Southampton and his genes using generosa. Also notice viva effigius. Again, nothing wrong with that, perfectly normal, but not the most common. Much more common to say vera effigius, meaning the true likeness rather than the likeness to the life, as it were. So why not put Vera, particularly since it resonates with the surname Vere, true likeness, and indeed the same Robert Vaughan, the same man who did that, wrote Vera effigies much about the same time on his engraving of Ben Jonson. So why not Vera effigius on Henry Vere? The only true going on seems to be down there at the bottom. Truly generous, as I say, innate, inherent, Henry, all capitalized, and Vere almost looking if it's been cast off in a bracket to say that the the genes, the blood, are those of Henry Rosalie, not so much of Vere. Talking of the writing at the bottom, you'll notice by comparing them, there's quite obviously one has been copied from the other. Look at the HT of right, the capital H of honourable. A very odd thing to do, because as I say, the later picture of Henry Vere is by a different engraver, a different designer, and sold by a different publisher. So what excuse is there to be copying this so closely? Let us turn now to the coat of arms above the Earl of Oxford's head. Of course, he didn't really have a right to display this coat of arms, since he wasn't the legitimate son of the 17th Earl of Oxford. I wonder if any of the viewers could write in the comments section if they have any ideas what this is about. You can just see tucked behind the left-hand side of the shield, at the back there, some sort of stick. And maybe it's a clue, a bit like this drumstick over here, a clue to what is known as the baton sinister. Robert Vaughan, who made this engraving, was highly knowledgeable about heraldry, and he of course knew exactly what a baton sinister was, and maybe he would have liked to have put one across this shield, but didn't quite have the courage. A baton sinister represents illegitimacy. So for instance, if you look at the coat of arms of the Dukes of Grafton, whose surname is Fitzroy, meaning fils-roi, the son of the king, you'll see this baton sinister, which goes from the third quarter across the centre and up to the second quarter from left to right, and it signifies an illegitimate line. They were the illegitimate line from King Charles II. Now, if we look here, of course there is no baton sinister, but cunning Robert Vaughan did not want to miss a golden opportunity. And look where that baton runs, right from what would be the third quarter into the second quarter across the centre of his breastplate. And if you look very carefully indeed, you will see in the first quarter on his armour there a 5-pointed star. So what Vaughan has done is sneakily create a simulacrum of the Vere coat of arms with its 5-pointed mullet, with a baton sinister right across the centre, showing that Henry Vere is an illegitimate scion of the House of Oxford. Very libellous indeed, and I think that explains this. Henry Vere, Earl of Oxford, Lord High Chamberlain, from an extra rare print by Robert Vaughan. Well, I expect Vaughan's original print was extra rare because it was libellous. And that's why this copyist has not included the baton and has not included the coat of arms. Very careful to avoid that libel, just as most artists are. They're all aware of heraldry, of course, and when they're drawing military commanders with their martial batons, they make a sincere effort not to put the martial baton right across the breastplate and signify illegitimacy. Even in the picture of Southampton, from which the Oxford picture is drawn, notice how that stick only covers the first quarter, it doesn't cross the centre, it is not in the third quarter, and is neatly tucked away there behind his wrist. Very different affair from what we get with the Earl of Oxford, a socking great baton right across the centre from the third quarter into the second quarter, signifying an illegitimate of the House of Vere. So we understand now what Robert Vaughan was doing. He took a 5 or 6-year-old engraving by Simon de Pass of Henry Rosalie, Earl of Southampton, and very carefully, very diligently, he moulded it into a portrait of the 18th Earl of Oxford, so that his intelligent, perceptive viewers would understand that the 18th Earl of Oxford was indeed the natural son of the 3rd Earl of Southampton. And this is very important for anyone who wishes to understand the first 18 sonnets of Shakespeare, the Venus and Adonis of Shakespeare, the Lucrece of Shakespeare, and all the great badinage that was going on between poets shouting at each other about this appalling scandal that took place in the 1590s. And most importantly, of course, it helps us to understand why it was that Edward de Vere needed, even after his death, to hide himself behind the pseudonym William Shakespeare. If it brings you pleasure watching these videos, please subscribe, share, and press the bell button to get future notifications. And if you're feeling kind, give it a little uptick, which I'm told very much helps the algorithms and jollies the whole thing along. Thank you very much indeed for watching.